So good morning. I, too, am indeed honored to be a part of such a wonderful collection of wisdom in the room. And I have some distinguished panelists joining me, and I'm going to introduce them in a few moments. But I'm particularly honored because I'm one of those people that I think was referred to as late development. I prefer the term chronologically gifted. So that might help with how one gets into that conversation later on today, as we're talking about the differences in generations. And so this session is really around the lived experience of difference. And when experience shows up, it speaks, and it speaks very loudly. It usually shows up as a feeling, a thought, an action, or a sense of being. In other words, legitimacy. And so that requires that you hear something about what the lived experience of an individual is. And recognizing that the individual is the expert on them. Nobody can tell me about me better than me. Nobody can tell me when I'm hurt, offended, disrespected, dismissed, and we can go on and on. And so part of what we're going to do in this session is tell stories, because stories help you to understand that lived experience of people, particularly those who are the only, or who find themselves being the only in an environment. When we refer to climate, I want you to accept the definition that's kind of our context, and that comes from the great philosophers, the Temptations. It's around the way you do the things you do. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about that as well. And I will also tell you that if I'd been given the liberty of a title for this panel, it would be a quote from my mom, who would say, "You cannot talk your way out of what you behaved your way into." So having said that,
that's a really good one.
Having said that, we're going to tell some of our stories and our lived experience and give you a chance to also participate with us in this discussion. So I'm going to start with a personal story before I introduce the panelists. I once went on a job interview that clearly I wasn't supposed to go to. The system had been set up in a way to make sure that people who looked like me weren't a part of the interview. What fouled the system and the play was that I had a name that they could not pigeonhole. So I was born with being named by my parents as Renee, R-E-N-A-Y. Now, as you can see on this tag here, this tent, it's R-U-M-A-Y. So that means that when someone started looking at transferring the information of my birth certificate, they could not read the physician's handwriting. You know, that used to be a sign of intelligence. So they changed the E to a U and the N to a M. I had been called Renee for 3 months. When the birth certificate came back, my mother looked at the name and said, odd child, odd name. Maybe this is divine intervention. And she decided to keep it. Well, actually, my mother may have been right, because that name got me into this interview. I found out later, after I had been employed, that people thought I was either French or Italian. So imagine the surprise. But it was very clear on the faces of the people interviewing me that I wasn't supposed to be there. And they were trying to figure out how to exclude me or get me to exclude myself from the process. That experience left me with some interesting feelings, some encounters with buried prejudice, with racism, with some pretty explicit bias as well as some implicit bias. And actually, you're going to hear a bit of this more as you hear from the panelists. So with that, let me introduce panelists. First of all, Kevin Mitchell. Kevin's Assistant Professor of Medicine and Pediatrics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Javid Sukera, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry and Pediatrics at the School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University. And Kimberly Templeton, past President, the American Medical Women's Association, and Professor of Orthopedic Surgery at the University of Kansas Medical Center. So we have quite a distinguished panel for you. So we're going to start with Javid. And actually what's going to be addressed by him are how implicit biases influence one's personal level as a clinician. And we'll also be answering some questions around, in today's workplace, even talking about bias can be challenging. So how can someone experiencing or witnessing bias address it? Javid.